Hello and welcome to another time-lapse sketching tutorial. Today I will show you how I created this mixed media sketch of the National Museum of Singapore with pen, ink, watercolor, and colored pencils. If you want to follow along, you can download the reference photo which is provided in the video description below. And as usual, this tutorial is the condensed version of the full-length tutorial I have created for my patrons. So if you want to watch the full tutorial, consider supporting me and my YouTube channel on Patreon. So I started this sketch with drafting lines to mark out the composition, just to make sure that I don't run out of space when I'm drawing, because I have a tendency to draw bigger and bigger when I draw. So using pencils to mark out the composition will help you lock in the composition. And if you are dealing with a complicated sketch, you may want to draw the whole thing, like sketch out the whole thing very quickly with pencils first, just to identify problematic areas or challenging areas, just to see where you make mistakes so that you can avoid them when you are creating your ink sketch. It is important to get the perspective accurate at the start of the sketch, because if you get the perspective wrong, all the details that you draw later will be affected by the inaccurate perspective. For example, in this case, if I have drawn the perspective of the building wrong, or the windows, or the arches, all those perspective will be wrong because they are actually affected by the perspective of the building. For this particular sketch, I wanted to try something different. I want to introduce colored pencils as well. So I have colored pencils for the trees in the background. The watercolor paper that I'm using is cold pressed watercolor paper, so the texture is kind of rough for colored pencils. If you really want to cover the white of the paper, you have to press quite hard with the colored pencils, and it's going to make the colored pencils blunt very quickly. So ideally, if you want to use colored pencils on watercolor paper, you should use hot press smooth watercolor paper, which works much better than cold press for dry media work, especially for pencils and colored pencils. For the right side, same thing, I'm using colored pencils. For the greens, I try to mix different colors, not just use a single green. When you use different colors to create a certain color, for example, with green, I have yellow green, I have light green, and I have dark green, and I mix all these colors together to form the green. It's going to make the shape more interesting compared to just using a single color. And this applies to using watercolor as well. Try not to mix your colors completely. In your mixing well, also have the watercolor mix on the paper in a way that you can still see the primary colors that you use to mix the mixture. So when you can see the primary colors that you use to mix the mixture, it's going to look more interesting. So now it's just me trying to fill in the details. The pen that I'm using is the Pelikan M200 fountain pen with sketch ink, which is waterproof pigmented ink that I've been using for a long time. There are some steps in front of the museum. When drawing straight lines, try to draw straight lines with one stroke. Don't draw the lines multiple times like what I am doing. And the reason why I'm doing that is because the paper is not directly in front of me. The camera is directly in front of the paper, but I'm seated by the side of the paper, so it's very difficult for me to draw that long straight line. So I'm wetting the paper with the intention to paint the sky so that we can get very soft gradation for the sky. The color that I'm using is manganese blue, the original manganese blue. If you want to use the same color, well, manganese blue is out of production. So the alternative, or one of the alternatives, is cerulean blue chromium or cerulean blue, which is also a granulating blue. It's a very beautiful blue that you can use for painting skies. For the internal shadow area, I'm using quinacridone gold. It looks alright. And for the cast shadow on the right side, you can see me test some color mixes here just to see which color mixes will work better. And I feel like this one works nicely. This is manganese blue with quinacridone red and maybe Hansa yellow. I'm not too sure about the colors that I've used. Anyway, when it comes to using a limited color palette, you just have to stick with the 3 primary colors that you have already selected at the start of the sketch. By using a limited color palette, it's very easy to achieve color harmony and have the colors work nicely together. Manganese blue, cerulean blue, and cerulean blue chromium are blues with low tinting strength. So when you add earth colors to the blues for mixing grays, you will get this gray, which is not very dark. So in this case, you can see the shadow contrast for the photo. It's not that strong, which is why I wanted to use manganese blue in this case. If you use phthalo blue or ultramarine, you can get darker shadows. But the downside with cerulean blue and manganese blue is if you want to mix darker shadows, shadows with very strong contrast, it's kind of impossible to do so, even if you use a lot of paint. For this sketch, if you feel like you need the shadows to be much darker, you will have to use French ultramarine and an earth color. Most of the sketch has already been painted, so now I just need to add additional details. For the grass at the bottom right, that's mixed with ultramarine and Hansa yellow to get that darker green. And I have also used Poscar markers to add details. I'm adding some magenta or red into the green to make it darker. Adding some red to the greens also make the greens look more interesting. So here I'm adding details I have accidentally left out earlier while drawing. If you use pen over watercolor, just note that the ink lines will become thicker. So to make the lines thinner, you can use the reverse side of the fountain pen, or you can hold the fountain pen more vertically. It seems the contrast of the shadow side of the museum isn't as strong as I wanted. I am just going to leave the shadow as it is, because if I paint another layer over the initial wash, chances are it's going to mess up the initial wash and lose the vibrancy. So right now you can still see some blues and some quinacridone red in the shadow area, which looks interesting. It's just that perhaps I could have used a bit more paint to make the shadows look more obvious. And that's because watercolor dries lighter. So the use of colored pencils does make this sketch look a bit more different. I like the contrast of the ink lines against the textured colored pencils. Thanks for watching. If you want to learn more about sketching, you can check out the many free tutorials I have on my YouTube playlist. The link is in the video description below.